So when I was on one of my trips while I was in Ireland. It's probably been 10 years ago at least. I was over there doing some storytelling at one of the festivals, and I went to a bed and breakfast, and in the town there was a beautiful sort of a Celtic shop across the street, had lots of Celtic carvings and such, and I'd gone in and I'd introduced myself. I'm Tom McDermott. I've been here in town doing some things, and he looked at me and he says, "Oh, you're a McDermott. Well, that's fine and good. Yeah, we have McDermotts. It's a well-known family name, yeah." And I said, "Yeah, I kind of feel at home." "Well, you should feel at home now." And I said, "But I'm thinking about something to take, back to the States." "Really? You're just taking yourself, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, but I want something to go, from, something from Ireland." And he says, "But you're Irish." And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess I am." I said, "My father was born here." He says, "I don't understand you at all." And then at that moment, a bus pulled up, and all of these tourists came out. It was, one of those buses that kind of drives, which is a good thing on the one hand, because you're up above the walls. There's so many walls on the roads. But here this bus stopped, and they pulled in, and he says, "Oh, saints help us." And then he says, "Just move aside." And then he goes and he starts tending like the 30 or 40 people that got off the bus, and he was rather frazzled and everything. Afterwards, he came up and he told me a story, and it never occurred to me until some time later what he actually meant by this story, but I want to pass it along to you. St. Patrick, as it turns out, patron saint of Ireland, not even born in Ireland, was Scottish, but as the patron saint of Ireland, was said that after he had died and gone to heaven, he was sitting around with the other angels and saints in the heavenly abode, and as is wont for Irish sometimes, they get a bit belligerent and a bit argumentative. And while other saints from other parts of the world, from other faiths of the world, were sitting there talking about their own people and how special they were, St. Patrick got a bit indignant, a little overly proud perhaps. And he looked at the others and he said, "You think your people are fine and good, do you? You think they're generous. You won't find a kinder soul on the Emerald Isle. The Emerald Isle, than you will find on the Emerald Isle. You'll find no one more generous, no one more selfless. Good people, good to the earth they are." And everyone else began to argue that their people were just as good as the Irish. But St. Patrick said he could prove it, and he had the perfect test, and he held up his forefinger. "It's been endowed with magical powers. I'll simply take the finger down to the earth, down to Ireland, and I'll start to point at things." He said, "I can tell you for sure that as I point to objects and turn them into solid gold, no matter who comes across the golden object, will leave it lying there. It's not theirs. They'll leave it for its rightful owner." Well, everyone else said, "Yeah, that may prove true one or two times, but certainly not all the way. Everyone, there's greedy people everywhere." He says, "I can prove it to you. They're good to the heart. They care about one another far more than they care about what they possess." So he went down to the island to prove his point. And the minute he disguised himself as an old vagrant, an old hermit of sorts. And the minute an elderly woman came from a marketplace, she was carrying some fruit and such. He pointed to the ground, a golden stone appeared, and the woman dropped her basket. She quickly picked up the object to examine it, and looking at it from every angle, she looked over at the old man and she says, "This can't possibly be real." He says, "Well, ma'am, I believe it is solid gold." She said, "Well, whose is it?" He says, "Well, I don't know for sure." She said, "Well, is it yours?" He says, "No, ma'am, it's not." She looked about, there was no one else, so she smiled at the old man and she said, "Fine, then it's mine, I'm keeping it." And she put it in her basket, started to walk into the village to exchange it. St. Patrick was a bit disappointed, but he was not flummoxed. He was determined to prove his point. The sad thing was, everywhere St. Patrick went, when he would create golden objects, everybody seemed to want them. As soon as they found out that they didn't belong to anybody that anyone knew about, they took them and walked off with them. St. Patrick had spent the whole day all over the island, reappearing, disappearing, the same thing everywhere. He was about to give up. They said this, the old man told me the story. He said, "St. Patrick climbed to the top of Croagh Patrick." It's a mountain just outside the village. We were not too far from Killarney. He says, if you go there, they call it Patrick's final spot. He climbed to the top there and was about to disappear. And as he was turning around to disappear, at the top of the mountain, he heard something. He heard a small child whistling. And St. Patrick thought to himself, is it not true the gospel itself says that a child will lead the way? I've been asking the wrong people. I should ask children. They're the future. And so he saw the young boy, and when the boy came up to the top of the mountain, he pointed his finger to the ground, and 3 or 4 stones turned into solid gold. They were like little golden marbles. And the boy stopped right in his tracks, and he picked them up, and he rolled them around in his hand, his eyes wide with delight. He looked up, he said, "Excuse me, mister, but are these yours?" He said, "Why, no, son, they're not." He said, "These are amazing. Well, did you just do this?" And St. Patrick smiled, and he said, "Well, yes, lad, I did. I suppose you'd be wanting to keep them." And to St. Patrick's surprise, the boy threw them down on the ground and said, "No, sir, I don't want them." Well, St. Patrick wasn't sure. He said, "Is it because it's not enough? I suppose if I point at that boulder over there and at that bush, turn those objects into solid gold." The boy said, "That's amazing. You're a wonder you are." "No, sir, I don't want them." St. Patrick was a bit confused. He was thinking, he started pointing objects all over the place. Things started turning to gold everywhere. The old fellow looked at me and said, "Unfortunately, a rabbit came out of a hole. It was gold too." The boy said, "I'm sorry for the rabbit. I don't want any of it." And St. Patrick was ready to transport the lad to heaven right then and there. He said, "I've been looking for someone like you to prove my point. I'm so hopeful now. Are you sure there's nothing that you want here?" And the boy said, "Well, I decided there is something I'd like to have." St. Patrick got a scorn in his face. He looked at the little boy and said, "Really? Well, I figured as much. Well, what would that be?" The boy grabbed his hand and said, "I'll take your finger." The old man that was the shop owner there, he looked at me, and I kind of laughed. I said, that was fun. He says, "You don't get it, do you?" And I said, "Well, not exactly." And he says, "Well, mister, I'm from Ireland and so proud of it. Why don't you see if you can't go find a piece of Ireland in yourself?" And then he turned around to tend to his customers. And I thought about this story as I was reading this text, because it occurred to me that seems a bit like what Jesus is saying here to the woman at the well. In a manner of speaking, it seems like, in fact, that the Samaritan woman at the well has heard a story all of her life. She's grown up with a story all of her life. And that story, of course, is that Samaritans are unclean. That Samaritans, as far as the Jews who are in power and the Romans with whom they're in power with, all of those folks figure that the Samaritans are pretty much a worthless crew, a worthless tribe, so to speak. And she herself, even the more so, because as the story unfolds later on in the rest of the text, she's been married several times and is not married now but still living with someone. The narrative as it stands is an indictment, sort of a moral indictment against this woman and her culture. And yet Jesus seems to be saying, when she starts to offer to draw from the well, Jesus says to her, if you had known who I am, and if you'd asked for it, I could have given you living water that would spring forth like a well from within. And that's a curious thing to say to someone. For one thing, this doesn't make any sense to her. For another thing, she knows who she is. In spite of the fact that she's got a self-destructive narrative going there for her, she knows who she is. And it's as if Jesus is saying to her, all of these other things, you worshiped here, there'll be a time where worship is everywhere. Your water is here. There's a place and a time where water springs from within that is living water. It's as if he's saying, like St. Patrick, or like the little boy, I should say, why go for the stuff when you could have the source? Now, the Gospel of John, a lot of you know this about the Gospel of John. It was written, the last Gospel to be written. It was written around the year 110, 115, maybe as early as 95 AD. But it's the last Gospel to be written, and it's written after the community had gone into a lot of changes and a lot of crises. The temple had fallen. And so the narrative completely different from the rest of the narratives of the other 3 Gospels. Now, in the 4th century, the council at Nicaea actually based their creed, which is one of the traditional creeds that Methodist Church and a lot of mainstream Protestant churches utilize. The Nicene Creed was basically based on a literal interpretation of this gospel. On the doctrine of atonement and sacrificial atonement, the doctrine of the Trinity, the incarnation of God, all of Jesus, of God in Jesus, all of these doctrines were formulated based on these sort of literal sayings of the gospel. But New Testament scholars have been kind of playing around with this for years. And from what I can tell and from what you can find out by reading yourself is that there are a number of scholars who begin to sort of think maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe this gospel isn't about literalizing. For example, a well springing up from within is a difficult thing to literally grasp, I think. Maybe it's not about literalizing. Maybe it's about understanding a deeper relationship with God, a mystical, deeper relationship with what is holy in the midst of our lives and what we miss all the time because, in fact, we get caught up in literalizing. Well, not we, but people, and a lot of people do. So in my mind, that this has less to do with those doctrines and more to do with the fact that Christianity is not about God being out there and coming in from time to time and changing things, but rather that humanity begin to recognize God who is already present, the kingdom which is already present within us. And if you realize that, what he was telling the woman at the well literally turned her narrative and the Jewish narrative of the time on its head. It literally turned it upside down. The American poet, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Muriel Rukeyser, she is a well-known poet. She has this wonderful phrase which I like, and Austin's going to throw this image up, I think. Do you have it? There it is. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. We are storytelling animals, so think about what it is that you do most days. Think about what you would do if you disagreed with something I just said. You'd find somebody, you'd tell the story about it. Think about if you really got excited about something I said. You'd find someone, you'd tell the story about it. After a day at work, you find someone, you tell the story about it. You get together with friends, you sit around a table, maybe like us with some friends, you gather over at the Modern Art Museum and it's First Friday and you listen to some music and you're having a glass of wine or tea or whatever, and you sit around and you start talking, you start telling stories. We're telling stories not simply to talk about what happened. We're also telling and listening to stories and reflecting on and echoing and then reframing stories because we're looking for a way to get connected. Stories literally connect us. Stories literally validate us. Whether it's a negative validation or a positive validation, we live by stories. In fact, the world might be made up of atoms and subatomic particles and molecules, but the reality is that we make sense of all of that by stories. So that even we live out familiar patterns of pain because it is our story, as it was for the Samaritan woman. I recently saw this TED Talk, and I want to point it out to you because I encourage you to go check it out. It's by a scientist, Don Hoffman. And Don Hoffman is at UC Irvine. He's a cognitive scientist. He has the title of his piece was, "Do We See Reality for What It Really Is?" Now, he's a cognitive scientist, so he's speaking about consciousness. And I'm not going to get too heady into that because we'll all get lost in some spiral and then wonder why I took you there. But what I really want to suggest is that he suggests we don't see reality as it is. We don't really perceive it quite literally. He says our brains are wired to reconstruct reality in order to make sense out of it. Because in reality, this table's not really here. I mean, it's here, but it's made up of atoms. It's made up of subatomic particles. It's made up of swirling things that we can't see. We see a picture on the screen, and the picture looks real, but in reality, if we could get close enough to it, if we could do microscopes, if we could magnify it, we would see pixels, right? We would see pieces of it. We wouldn't even see the whole picture. Our mind has these little physiological hacks. In fact, they don't even understand why our minds do this, but we literally reconstruct what we're seeing in order to make sense out of it. And because we live in certain cultures and have grown up in certain ways and adapted certain ways, some of these things we do pretty automatically. But for example, sometimes it takes major shifts to change our mind about things, change how we perceive things. Now, if I said to you the earth is flat, you'd immediately look at me and say, well, that's the most idiotic thing I could imagine. But there was a time in where reality was literally flat. You could actually go to the edge and fall off. If I told you, in fact, that we were the center of the universe, that the sun revolved around us, that the universe revolved around us, you would say that's nuts. You can watch it yourself. But you would see the same thing that people saw 400 years ago, 500 years ago, only for some reason they saw it as revolving around us, as opposed to us seeing it as revolving around the sun. What changed? The narratives. Perception changed, and then the narratives changed, and then as we developed and adapted, so did our narratives. But the reality is that because it's hard to perceive the minuscule reality that we live in, it's hard to perceive the details. Our mind kind of creates a hack, and we see what we can make sense out of. It's an adaptive thing. But I'd like to kind of take a leap of faith, because one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Peter Mayer, who many of you have heard many times when he's come through here, an amazing poet and lyrics that are like prayers. You know the song, Everything is Holy Now. What's really amazing to me is that when you get to that point, when you get to that place where you take that leap of faith, where it's no longer how you see things literally, that when we talk about a miracle, we have to see a magic show. We have to see a finger pointing at the ground and turning a stone into gold, as if some kind of alchemical process could happen magically. What happens is we've suddenly made a leap of faith with a period once we've got that understanding. And now when we put things together, we put it together with a whole different sense of wonder. So that you listen to the lyrics of Everything is Holy Now. When I was in Sunday school, we learned about the time when Moses split the sea in two and Jesus made the water wine. And I remember feeling sad because the miracles don't happen still. I mean, imagine you're a kid and you hear these stories and you're wondering, well, where are those miracles? But now I can't keep track because everything is a miracle. Wine from water is not so small. An even better magic trick is that anything is here at all. So the challenging thing becomes not to look for miracles, but finding where there isn't one. Hoffman says that we perceive this wonder and complexity, incomplete as it is, because it's too much for our brain to handle. But what I want to suggest, and what I want to be talking about for the next several weeks, is that in fact we take reality and story it in a way that makes sense to us. But not because it's the best way, but because our brains get lazy. We get hooked and we reinforce narrative patterns in our lives. And so we don't see things differently. And no matter how many times we might go to a counselor to change the narrative we've been living, somehow we end up still living out those narratives, like the woman at the well. These ad clips represent some of the most embedded narratives that we live by. The one which is more profound, of course, was first coined by a guy named Herbert Spencer, who took Darwin's theory of natural selection, and he came up with social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is simply the way that first ad sort of suggested. Did anybody pick that up in the ad? 2,400,800 and so many people. I'm just one person. I'll take those odds. What's that narrative about? Me against the world, I'll make my way, I can do it, and I got a car called the Edge. I'm unstoppable. Which was what the song was. That's a profound and prominent narrative. It's embedded in everything we do. It's embedded in everything we do. Everything we do. It's embedded in church, where ministers vie unconsciously, subconsciously for greater churches, for higher positions. It's embedded in every aspect of our business. It's embedded in our educational system. It's the sense of crawl over that person or they're going to crawl over you. It's social Darwinism. We sort of accept it almost blindly without thinking about it. The second ad presented a more compelling counter-narrative, and yet one which is always sort of going up against it, right? Because then we have the liberals, and then we have the socialists, and then we have all of those evil people. But what did that narrative say? The narrative said, the way to stop this poison from killing us is for all of us to do it together. It turns the other one on its head. So before we finish, I want to suggest to you one thing. Maybe these narratives are not always the best narratives. Maybe just because it's easier we should challenge ourselves to think a little differently. Maybe the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves really aren't the story that Jesus, that the gospel, that the power of the gospel, that the holy in our midst would ask for us, that would have for us, offer to us. Maybe we're not really drawing from the depths of what we're potentially capable of doing or being. And if a narrative doesn't work, maybe we should ask if it should be changed. The challenge is, of course, and that's what I want to talk about next week, is how to change these narratives. I've shared the story in here, the little parable that my friend Elizabeth Ellis used to tell me, the storyteller over in Dallas. She used to say there was a man who lived in hell, but he could never leave because he knew the street names too well. Right? Have we ever been there? The way AA always talked about it was it's the hole in the road. We fall in the hole, we get out of the hole, and then we come back and we fall in the same hole again. But the reality is we live by these narratives because our brains get lazy. It's an adaptive feature. Our lifestyles get lazy. We follow the same patterns all the time. It's a challenge to change the narrative, even when the narratives are self-destructive, even when the narratives are other-destructive. It's a challenge to change those narratives. It's a challenge to not judge somebody based on what we've always thought. But what Jesus just comes in and simply says is, that narrative's all wrong, turns it upside down. There is a way to perceive and understand our narratives. There is a way to change those narratives. And I want to suggest that one of the things we often do is that instead of changing a narrative, we simply change the characters and the setting. But we don't actually change the narrative. Jesus wasn't changing the characters and the setting for the Samaritan woman. He literally changed the whole motivation behind it. He literally changed the whole driving direction of that narrative. You can look at the 3 little pigs and turn it into the 3 little javelinas, right? It's still the 3 little pigs story. It's just now 3 little javelinas. You could be my friend over here, Todd Kirk's philosopher and psychologist, and you could say the 3 philosophers. And the wolf is the existential crisis. It's still the same story. I saved that for the end so that you'd actually be listening while for the first part of the sermon and not trying to figure out that new narrative. The reality is that we can't simply change the setting and change the characters. We have to change what drives the narrative to begin with. That's what Jesus does in this story. He simply changes the whole motivation and turns it on its head. It's challenging, and it's difficult. I want to end, though, we're going to do this some more next week, and then I've got some special guests coming in to share some stories as well from other cultures, so I hope you can join us. But I want to end with this because we read it last week, and it was a profound poem that Rumi wrote, the 13th century mystic, Middle Eastern mystic. And the poem is so profound and it says so much. I shared with you how he ran into Shams, his teacher, a guy who was a vagrant, who was kind of considered a fool, and who everybody dismissed, and yet he ran into him, and it simply raised that question for him. It raised for Rumi, maybe you've been looking at everything wrong. Maybe there's another way to see reality. And it literally turned his world upside down. He no longer was the keeper of the law. Now he was the feeler of the truth. Now he was the one who wanted to be present to God in every moment. So here's the poem he wrote. And I'll close with this. So band, you guys can go ahead and get up and get ready. Rumi said, "Who gets up early to discover the moment light begins? Who finds us here circling bewildered like atoms? Who comes to a spring thirsty and then sees the moon reflected in the spring? Who, like Jacob, blind with grief and his age, smells the shirt of his lost son and then suddenly can see again? Who lets a bucket down into the spring and brings up a flowing prophet? Or like Moses goes for fire and finds what burns inside the sunrise? Jesus slips into a house to escape enemies and opens a door into the eternal world. Solomon cuts open a fish and finds a golden ring. Omar storms to kill the prophet and leaves instead with blessings. You chase a deer into the woods, you end up everywhere. You find an oyster opens its mouth and it ends up swallowing a drop that becomes a pearl. A vagrant wanders empty ruins and suddenly he's wealthy. But don't be satisfied with stories. how things have gone with others. Unfold your own myth with complicated explanation so that everyone will understand your passage. We have opened you. Start walking towards shams. Your legs will get heavy and tired. Then comes a moment, a feeling. The wings that you have grown are suddenly lifting.